Brain bleeds, let's talk about it. There are 4 main brain bleeds you should know. This includes epidural, subdural, subarachnoid, and intracerebral. First, let's talk about epidural hematoma. This is a brain bleed between the dura and the skull. This is typically caused from trauma and fracture of the temporal skull, resulting in rupture of the middle meningeal artery. There are 3 classic phases of epidural hematoma when it comes to clinical symptoms. The first is a brief loss of consciousness. This usually happens right after the trauma where the person cannot be awoken. The second becomes a lucid interval that the person is now awake. They might be a little confused of what's going on. Overall though, they're gonna seem fine. Third and final stage is the neurologic deterioration where the intracranial pressure of the brain bleed increases so much that the person may go into a coma and just go completely alter mental status. When arriving to the ER, you want to get a CT without contrast showing a bulging biconvex lens. It's also important to note that it does not cross a suture line due to the dura attachments to the skull. The brain bleeds often confused with epidural hematomas are subdural hematomas. This hematoma occurs between the dura and arachnoid space and thus presents as a venous source. Venous source is usually the bridging veins and it's usually due to a trauma. Questions like to associate this with the elderly, alcoholics that fell, and then usually an unwitnessed fall. Due to the venous supply of this hematoma, it usually takes longer to present than an epidural hematoma, and thus will be associated with a gradual rise in neurologic symptoms like dizziness, nausea, headache, and stuff like that. When arriving to the ER, you also get a CT without contrast, and this will show a crescent shape. And I like to think the crescent shape as a sub, as in a sandwich sub. If you're from Philadelphia, you're not going to think of it as a sub, you're going to think of it as a hoagie. And when I say sub, for people that don't know, I mean a sandwich, like a chicken parm hero. Similar to the epidural hematoma, the subarachnoid hemorrhage has an arterial supply, but the arterial supply is due to the circle of Willis instead of the middle meningeal artery, those exterior arteries. Instead of trauma like the epidural hematoma, this one's typically caused from Berry aneurysms in the circle of Willis. Unlike epidural and subdural hematomas, this bleeding occurs between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. The things that put you most at risk for this include cigarette smoking as well as history of hypertension. So what are the clinical manifestations of this? Unlike the other ones, this comes on suddenly without trauma typically and is usually the worst headache, like a thunderclap headache that's usually described in the person's life. It's also associated with nausea, vomiting, seizures, and even things like photophobia. For diagnosis, you're going to want to get a CT without contrast as the initial choice, and if it doesn't show up and you're still suspicious of a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you're going to get a lumbar puncture, which will show xanthochromia or blood in the cerebrospinal fluid.